So this is a completely open forum this week. Hoping to get people to get some additional information. Hopefully people are working to get some things in for the mock review panel. I want to encourage people to be open to that, and I think we've set up the instructions in terms of your research strategy can be at a fairly preliminary spot, along with your specific aims. If you're applying to mechanisms other than the NIH, there's places to indicate that. And this is an opportunity to get some friendly and constructive feedback at an early time point. And again, I don't want people to be afraid of doing this. It's much in many ways better than getting responses that are coming from a unknown panel later anonymously. So our goal is really to get these things out there to you and get you some feedback to help as sort of a culmination of the course. I think that's my major message today. I think at this point, I think the two sorts of potential topics we can cover with some of the additional time are sort of number one. I think if people have any other specific questions about where things are going with their development that I or some of the other faculty who are on could address, that would be, we'd be happy to answer those questions. If not, well, I'll open it up for that. Why don't we see if there's anybody out there, you'll need to unmute yourself as everybody's been automatically muted. If people want to ask some questions about their current development process, I'd be interested in those, or share some things that they think have gone really well or other barriers. So the other, if people are still thinking of those things, I'll certainly field those questions as they come up. One of the other things that I thought would be helpful would be, each year we're trying to do things that would improve the course. And I know many of you, and thank you, have filled out course evaluations. But I would be really interested to hear from trainees and or faculty about ideas that would make the course even better next year, or things that you like that we did, things that maybe we don't need to do as much of, or ways that perhaps we could change things that would make the course work better for you if you were taking it again. So sort of thinking forward to future cohorts. Enjoy, they have the ability to unmute themselves. So maybe as one example, does anybody have any ideas for the office hours that we held? Would there be anything that would have made those office hours work better for you when you were meeting with faculty from outside your small group?
There's also the chat box if anyone's interested.
Another idea, one of the things we had in a couple of the first years of the course is we did an exercise where we ran a mock IRB, and I see that there's another question after that. I guess what does anybody out there have any thoughts, to get a sense as to perhaps what some of the human subjects implication of your protocol would be? What would people think of a mock IRB, knowing that we've all had interesting feedback from IRBs over time, getting a sense as to maybe some issues with your protocol that you might not be seeing? Give me some potential strengths and weaknesses of a mock IRB, perhaps.
I mean, this is Mehul Patel. I guess a potential weakness is that, all of our studies probably fall on some range of minimal to greater than minimal risk. And so, IRBs always kind of judge those applications differently. But I mean, I think the strength would be, I think, just seeing how an IRB goes through kind of the 111 criteria and maybe how they look through an informed consent form and what are the sort of main elements, their basic elements that they're looking for in the consent form. So if you do a mock IRB, kind of think of it as, what are the sort of universal things that all most protocols will have reviewed. But keeping in mind that some of ours are minimal risk and some are more than minimal risk and anywhere in between.
One of the things that we found when we used to do the mock IRB was that a lot of the feedback we get as investigators comes even before the ethical review. Like, it comes from the regulatory staff of the IRB itself. And the amount of regulatory staff and their expertise, as Mehul points out, that can also vary across institutions and certainly vary across risk levels as well, in terms of how much pre-evaluation your protocol might get, or your consent form. So I think those are good. I think those are good questions. There's a question regarding the acceptability of K23 submissions for NINDS, and Pooja and I had a few conversations back and forth with some people at NINDS about that, and I think the two sides of the coin on on things that are using the clinical trials FOA at NINDS. I think the situation is similar to how it has always been, other than the fact that there is a mechanism where the clinical trials applications to the K23 mechanism have these additional bits of information in the application, the clinical trial synopsis, the sample size justification, and so forth. So I think from that perspective, that presents an opportunity because it gives you a little bit more space to better define some of the things that are important for clinical trials. In terms of the broader question, what forms of clinical trials would be believed to be achievable during a K23, noting that the majority of the effort is for the support of the faculty member, and there is a relatively limited amount of project support. I think that potential challenge is still there. This is going to sound a little bit like a non-answer, but so there's still challenges in terms of what sorts of designs can go through because of the the situation where you just don't have a lot of that project support. What what typically works very well in terms of K23s is something where you're building upon another ongoing project in terms of data collection and with independence and important and exciting aims. In a pilot clinical trial as part of a K23 or a more feasibility trial, I think they can be done. And I think if they're spec'd out right and you have the right resources and access to patient populations, I think there is a real possibility. The historical track record, it's just been a little challenging for there to be good, feasible, yet scientifically important projects that are defined as clinical trials. But we do use a relatively broad description of clinical trials these days, and I think, certainly single site study feasibility studies and other studies. We've had the talks before that focus on designs in those spaces. I think, the risk is, as always, submitting something that looks more like an underpowered phase 3 trial, and then that can be challenging. I guess any other questions or follow-ups on that before I go on to the next subject?
I have a question about that. So I've spoken to a couple of folks involved in the K23 program and asked about doing a feasibility trial in preparation for a later multi-site efficacy trial. And the feedback I got was that would be of limited scientific interest, of a feasibility trial. It would be a hard sell because it's just a feasibility trial. And so I've been thinking about trying to combine both feasibility and dose finding, but I'm kind of curious if you have suggestions about how to make it a more substantive trial while still, within the limits of a single site sort of K23 fundable project.
Yeah, I think if you're purely looking at feasibility aims, then I would completely agree. Now, if there are other things that you can do alongside that, whether it's mechanistic work in humans that validates animal work with biomarkers or other parameters that would be where there would be sort of legitimate learning within the small sample size place, dose finding is a potential area. The challenge with dose finding, it just sort of depends. It could take quite a few patients to do good dose finding, and most of the time, a really adequately sized dose finding study is going to be something that would be larger than what would typically be, I think, feasible within a K23. So I think if you submit only a feasibility trial, then that would probably be criticized as not quite being scientifically important enough, because at the end of the day, you're going to either have it be feasible or not. Now, I think what people would like in terms of ideal projects are things that would come up with with other scientifically interesting information, so that there's complementary aims that maybe deal with mechanism, target engagement, longitudinal course of disease, something else that you could learn about that would be sort of part of the package, and with the feasibility trial being one of those sorts of sub-projects within the larger clinical project, if that makes some degree of sense. I think if it's simply looking at a couple of major or one or two major feasibility aims that would say this is ready for a phase multi-center phase 3, or getting ready for a dose finding study, I think you're right. I think that's going to be a little bit of a tough sell, but having some more meat in terms of the other scientific aims and learning about the biology of the treatment and how that's interacting with the disease, I think that would be a strategy that would resonate. But I think a pure focus on feasibility is, you're right, I think that's going to be hard. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
And again, it may be, if there is something that if you can learn more about how dose responds to a biomarker, so that you have a little bit more resolution, I would sort of say if I was to use my oftentimes example of stroke, it'd be really hard to do a dose finding study of anything in stroke in a K23, just because if you're looking for potential movement on something like the Rankin or even change in the NIH stroke scale, it's just going to take quite a few patients for any treatment to induce anything, at least an acute stroke. So, but if it was a feasibility study in stroke where I'm looking at perhaps some motivational biomarker, whether it's infarct growth or something like that is just a random example, then potentially that is something where you're actually going to have some potential for meaningful findings that your treatment at different doses is doing different things to infarct growth. So that's I think that's sort of the trick in that space. I think the next question was a lecture on the IND and IDE process. And we've had we had a small talk on that in most years. And it can be very variable across what, when we think about INDs and IDEs for sponsor investigators, what people experience and what can vary, and also institutions support you differently in these things. And I think that's a good suggestion, though. Like, to me, we've covered that at the residential course before, but that might be something that's really, because you're probably going to need to start thinking about whether you need an IND or IDE even earlier than the residential course. The IND, IDE talk may be something that's better as a webinar in the spring before people are getting together. Yeah, we've had some talks before, and and one of the nice things about that, we might be able to get somebody from FDA to be on an IND and IDE panel. I think we've had speakers before. It can be challenging in the FDA's budget for them to get the authorization to travel. So, and yeah, I think actually there is a talk, and that I'm pretty sure that we have in our archives from John Marler at FDA on. It's mostly focused on drug-based INDs from the perspective of a sponsor investigator. He was a program director at NINDS for some time before moving on to FDA, and that was a fantastic talk. If we don't have that up on the website, we'll look to find that. One other question I had for the audience is, one thing that I thought was very potentially illustrative was that some of the things that we do in the residential course would have been good for people to have seen earlier in their protocol development process. What would you think if we had the residential course a bit earlier in the process in future years, where you get together you get some initial protocol development and question development, but say, as opposed to having kind of 6 small groups before the residential group, having maybe 2 or 3. What would people, I'm interested in the reflections of the trainees on that. And potentially, if it had been in June versus July as opposed to August.
Hi, this is Sami Kassab. I think this would be a great idea because for people planning to apply for a mechanism other than NIH and NIDS. For me, for example, deadline is in 2 weeks. So having the course earlier on, the course was extremely helpful, getting more ideas, trying to polish the protocol and the strategy. But now I think with this time a little bit too short of a period of time to get everything ready for a deadline of October 18, for example.
Any other thoughts on timing? Yeah, Migio, it was at a good time, good balance of time, and it always and one of the things though, there's sort of two areas of the parameter. We could try to get things organized a little bit earlier so that maybe as opposed to most of the small groups starting in June and July, really trying to get those small groups, making use of May and really getting the small groups going so they're starting right after AAN, with that AAN being a little late this year. And even maybe with AAN so late this year, maybe even one is earlier. The I guess if you were to sort of have your druthers, how many people, if we think about exactly how we set up when the small group meetings are, if they were at a pretty good balance, that's good. But how many people in terms of, it sounds like Sami has good reasons to suggest based on the fall deadlines that are in the October time period that moving things a bit earlier could be helpful so that we could get actionable feedback to people earlier. What do other people think about June versus July or August? It's sort of at the end of the typical medical academic year, so that can introduce some challenges and perhaps opportunities.
I mean, this is Mehul again. I mean, I think I would have liked the residential course earlier. Like Sammy was saying, maybe June-ish. I think for me, I'm still working through the science, and I think getting together with a bunch of folks in Ann Arbor was helpful, and just talking through kind of the more theoretical and conceptual issues rather than just fleshing out the protocol. So I think getting that stuff discussed earlier then will make the protocol writing, of course, a lot easier and would move along faster. So I would like to maybe got together a bit earlier.
Yeah. So I think Dr. Trummer has pointed out you do need to get your idea to a certain place to benefit maximally. And I think it's just a little bit of a balance, and it's going to vary for different people. But that midpoint of having some time for development afterwards, after you build somewhat of a rapport with your group in advance, but then you get to really bounce your ideas off a lot of people at the course. All right, I think that's, at least from my perspective, I think that's very helpful. Did anybody else have any other clinical trials course questions or questions on their current protocols right now? Yeah, I think that's a really good point. What we've had is really to focus on getting to the well-written protocol, and get the scientific idea really firmed up at the residential course. So I think if we try to shift too much till afterwards, there will be some challenges in terms of where people go, what they're doing over the summer, and loss of momentum. So Migio, that's a really good point in terms of the potential for the opportunity for things to kind of potentially slide as we go into the home environment. Yeah, I mean that's a good point, Dr. Conway. It may be that July offers more. The upside of June, if we can get enough of the small groups done early, would be you could anticipate a June course, a couple sessions afterwards, really well organized sessions, perhaps starting in early April, with some of the groups, having the faculty organized into groups in advance, so that we can really get you assigned quickly and matched quickly into groups. And if we get the groups going early enough, so you have all those times to iterate, either a June or July course. The advantage of June is it makes it actually potentially plausible to try to have a early September mock study section, so that if people are out there applying to October deadlines, they could get some feedback that they could use in advance of that. With July, it may be a little harder to get to that point. So I think we have we have some surveys out to the faculty as to which times they can do it. So, and we're meeting as our executive committee. We continue to meet and kind of think about these things programmatically going forward. So I think with that, unless anybody else has any other questions, I didn't have any other topics to cover today. All right. Well, if there aren't any further questions, it was good talking to you all today, and we will see you next time.